All right, good morning. It's Tuesday, and I hope everything's well in your world. And looking forward to the week and everything going on. And it's going to be a great day. It's time change, messing with some of you. I hear all of my guys yesterday were talking about just messing with them a little bit. So uh, my voice a little deeper today. I think I've got a cold going on, so we're just going to work through that and keep plugging away. Man, so glad to be in this book. It's been rich. It's been amazing. Just yesterday, just reliving uh, the Apostle Paul and just his journey. And he knows he's at the end of his life, and so he's when we study the letter, you can see this is more of an emotional deal for him than most of the other letters that he's written. So this is the last record of writings that we have of the Apostle Paul. It's not to say that he didn't write others. It's just these. This is the one that was inspired by God to be preserved and kept for us in what we call the Scriptures. And so um, I want to. We're still kind of in the introductory remarks, and I find this really intriguing. What we're looking at here today, and reflective, and so I want us to kind of keep in spirit with that. So in the looking at this, hopefully we're going to be asking ourselves a few questions as well as we progress through this. So let me just read the text, and then we're gonna comment on that. We'll begin at the beginning. He says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, in keeping with the promises of life that is in Christ Jesus, to my Timothy, my dear son, grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus our Lord. I thank God, whom, whom I serve as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience. As night and day, I constantly remember you in my prayers. Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy myself. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you. Man, there's nothing but goodness that flows from that passage. And so you can imagine Paul sitting in that dungeon, chained, with possibly just a little wooden table and a quill, whatever it is. He could have had someone writing these. He has in the past. In fact, Timothy co-authored a lot of the scriptures that he wrote before, but Timothy's not there. So whether this is, his writing, whoever, this is essential that we understand. Paul sitting in this place, really wondering, I do, whether he even knows the difference between night and day, stuck in a hole like this, and so he's got lots of time to think, not a lot of other things going on. So he spends his time praying. He spends his time, reminiscing. He's forward thinking about the ministry of Christ and passing the torch. And so this is the beginning of that passing of the torch. And I want us just to see it unfold. So it's somewhere in the sitting in this dungeon, his mind drifts to Timothy, as it does often, apparently. And I think he's doing some self-reflection about who's been with him, who's been faithful to be with him, who brings him joy, who's bailed on him, right? Because he writes about that, and we looked at that yesterday. Demas, having loved this present world, has gone here, and these others have gone there. And he said, man, I'm just kind of by myself. I got no one here. And so he's thinking about those things, and he's thinking obviously about his life, and he's reviewing his whole life and looking at things. And it's what happens as you get older and there's more time on your hands in that sense. Specifically for Paul, had Paul not been in prison, he'd still be plodding away, doing trips and missionary journeys and just preaching the gospel to the lost. But God has him in a prison where his mind is less moving in various places, although it's still wheels are turning. And so we see this, and he says that, hey, man, I thank God whom I serve. So let's just look at this. Who do you appreciate? Because this is what he's writing. So when you think about your life, whether it's a young life or an old life, it doesn't matter really at this point. Just as if you were to be sitting still and not not, which we have a hard time doing these days, right? Everybody wants to be on their phone or somewhere, something. They've got to be busy doing something. But if you were forced to have sat for quite a while in a room, dark room, to think about life, whose names would come to mind? And this is what's happening in Paul. I want us to get into this thought process. Who does he appreciate? Who does his mind drift to when he's lonely like he is? So think about you. As you get lonely, which many of you maybe not, but a lot do, whose name comes to mind? Who is it? And this is where Paul is. And so we're going to be thinking about these things. And so he's thought about those things, and we'll see that unfold. He's also thought about his actions in the past, right? In times before, as he sat in prison, there were those who said he was there because of his wrongdoing, because of his arrogance, because of his, whatever. And so that can weigh on you a little bit. And so you're sitting here in a place that you don't want to be. How many of you can relate maybe to being in a place where you don't want to be and you think, am I here because God's punishing me, or am I here truly because I'm being a drink offering for the king? Why am I here? Is God punishing me, or is God using this to get me to another place? That's why the term clear conscience comes up. He says, man, I thank God. Now, what he's getting ready to do is say, I thank God as I constantly remember you in prayer. That's the short version of it. But he's placed these parameters in there, these little rabbit trails that let us see beyond that. But this is basically him saying, man, I thank God for you, Timothy, whom God has caused me in the thinking of that to pray constantly for you. But he adds these tidbits, which are amazing. I thank God, whom I serve, as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience. So, man, there's a boatload of truth in there. Let's just kind of look at that. The word serve is the latreo. It's the word worship. He says, man, as I'm sitting here and looking, and the fact that I have worshiped God from the moment I met him, all the way to now as I sit in this dungeon, my conscience is clear. The Spirit's not accusing me of anything, and I am not really accusing myself. I've been doing some self-examination here. That's a good place to be, isn't it? I've been doing a lot of that recently, just in my own season of life and where I am. And recently I've begun walking again the city streets, and did that yesterday, only different area. Went to Homewood yesterday and walked, but I just walk and I'm just talking with the Lord, and I'm just saying, Lord, what's the season of life that you have me in? Is there something? Is there something you want me to do? Where are we? Because I'm really enjoying where I am. I'm pretty comfortable with what's going on in my world, but man, I'm longing for some things, and so I'm just praying, and I'm saying, Lord, do I still have game, or do you still want to use me somewhere? What's going on? And so I can kind of relate to Paul in this sense of just examining yourself. And so I guess I'm asking, do you ever do that? And if you don't, you ought to take time to just go, all right, is there sin in my life, right? I think we don't examine our lives well enough, and it's more difficult the busier life gets. We don't slow down. Man, our fingers are moving, or thumbs, however it is, you get your voice heard through your phone or through your computer, whatever social media you're doing, or whether it's the old-fashioned pick up the phone and call. All of those things, whatever that is, if we slow down and just say, okay, let's take stock of my own life. Let me examine my own life. An unexamined life is not worth living. And so we should examine it. Where can I do better? Where have I failed? And so Paul has been doing that, sitting in that prison cell. And he says, my conscience is clear. I am not here because I'm a screw up. I am not sitting in this prison cell because God's put me in timeout. I am here for a purpose. And you can almost see this welling up inside of Paul as he's just gearing up to write this letter that is going to be somewhat his swan song. But this letter is powerful of passing the torch. And so you hear as we read and go through this text, you're going to see Paul gain a more and more authority of passing the torch, of saying, not, hey, Timothy, it'd be good if you thought about this and maybe you should think about that. It is, hey, this is what's got to happen. This is what's got to happen in you. This is what's got to happen in the church. This is why. And so we're going to see that unfold. And so he's just going through this. Now, this clear conscience thing is a big deal to Paul. Do you remember? He said that in 1 Timothy 5, right? The goal of our instruction is love from what? A pure heart, a clean conscience, right? A good conscience. In other words, let's make sure we're not loving for a wrong reason. So he was saying that already to Timothy earlier. He's in 3:9. He says, hey, we hold to this mystery of the faith. Man, we're holding on to this faith that the gospel is for the Gentile with a clear conscience. I know that this is what God's called me to. I am not perverting the gospel. I am not. He's being accused of the very things he was accusing the others of, right? Of stealing the Jewish faith and culture and everything else. He goes, this is not it. This is the mystery that God has unfolded, that he came to save not just the Jews, but the whole world. And he said, man, I do this with a clear conscience. I know that what I'm teaching is right. And then in chapter 4, he speaks of those who men who have seared consciences. And so he's trying to say, hey man, let's don't let that be about you and me. And so Paul is near death and he's re-examining himself. And he's saying, listen, I'm coming from a long line of this stuff. The way my ancestor did, I'm serving God. I have a history here. Now, whether he's speaking of serving God, he means through the apostles, the prophets. Like the prophets before him, he speaks of this and says, hey man, I'm in line with all of them. I'm proclaiming truth. The truth that God gave to me, I'm now proclaiming. And he gave to me that I was going to be an apostle to the Gentiles and that he would show me how much I would suffer for his name and that this would be how I would spend the rest of my days. And so he says, man, I'm just faithfully serving. It is my time. This day was made for me and I was made for this day. He appointed the exact times and places which we should live, and he has given me good works that I should walk in them. You remember all of those messages that he speaks through his letters. And so he's saying, I'm fulfilling this. I'm just falling in line. I'm the next one in the water, cruising down this river of life, sharing the gospel of Christ. Whether he means those ancestors or maybe he means his physical ancestors, because he did come from good stock. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, and he knows that, and he knows the history of his father and all the others. And we can assume that they were all faithful Jewish people. And so they were worshipers of Jehovah, and they were doing it from a good conscience, looking for the Messiah. And so we can believe that to be true. But he could also mean that in the sense of the apostles. He's one, he says, untimely born, right? I'm an apostle, but kind of untimely born. I didn't get to really walk with the living Christ, nor did I see his crucifixion, nor did I see him physically after the resurrection, which were all necessary to be an apostle. But he says, I was one untimely born. Therefore, I was caught up into the third heaven, and there I saw all of these things. And so I have walked with the risen Christ. I have seen in the retelling of his story in that heavenly vision that he gave to me, his crucifixion and his resurrection. And so I am now walking with the living Christ. And so maybe it's that, whatever it means, he's surveying his history and says, hey man, I come from good stock. Now, some of us maybe not. I did. I was blessed to have great parents. But Paul is simply saying, man, I thank God whom I serve. I have a heritage here, and I'm just passing it on. I'm doing it with a clear conscience. I have not fallen off the wagon. I have not veered left, so to speak. I've done none of those things. So it's possible that he's thinking about his judgment of sitting there, and he's going, hey, it's not because I've veered. I'm faithfully doing what I read in the Old Testament. I'm faithfully doing that. My conscience is clear. You can see here's a man that's like, this fog that Satan wants to throw at me to make me think that my usefulness is up. That's not. He is so wrong. And so he's been doing a lot of thinking, and now he's thinking about who is with me out there. Who everybody's left me, but Timothy, his name keeps coming up as I pray. And so I'm going to write him. I'm going to let him know these things. And so you can kind of feel that going on, sitting in that dungeon as he is. And so he's been examining himself. And because he has a lot of time on his hand, what's he doing? He's praying. He's just praying. And so this is what he says. He says, man, all this stuff's with a clear conscience. As night and day, I constantly remember you in my prayers. And he said, man, when I pray, whether it's night, whether it's day, even if he knows what it is, he says, your name keeps surfacing. So I got, for me, it's thinking, well, whose name keeps popping up in my prayer life as I begin to pray? Who does God keep letting me reminisce about? Who am I missing? Because he goes on to say that, recalling your tears, I long to see you, so I may be filled with joy. He said, man, when I bow my knee and to the Maker and I begin to pray, he said, your name comes up. And as I think of your name, I recall the last time we met in tears as we knew that might be the last time that we would see each other. And man, you're like a son to me. And he said, so as I see your face in my prayers, he said, man, I recall those tears, the passion that we have between other, what it means to be a band of brothers, a brotherhood. This is not some weird kind of relationship. This is a holy relationship where a man has a younger man that he's been pouring his life into, and there's just this rich, undeniable bond. He is in love with this guy. And so you see this going on. He goes, man, I miss you. Sitting here in this dungeon, I long to see you. I want to see you again. And man, I want to be filled with joy. I just, man, to be able to look at you and to tell you how much I love you and to be able to be filled with joy, I long for that. And so I love the vulnerability that we're seeing here of Paul as he does this. So he's writing letters. He's sharing Christ with the guards. He's reviewing his life. He's cataloging friendships and going, whose name keeps popping up? Timothy. And so, man, I think it's good for us sometimes just to slow down long enough to say, all right, Lord, how's my conscience? Is there some area in my life where you want to work? Is there some sin going on that needs to be dealt with? Is there something to get me from here to there that I've got to stop doing? Is my conscience clear? And so I think it's good for that. I think it's good sometimes just to say, Lord, who have you blessed me with that maybe I've not paid attention to, that I've not really thought about? And God keeps bringing people's names to mind. It's powerful when you start seeing this way. And so one name comes up and he begins to write. This is Paul passing the torch. We're going to see, we start tomorrow with Paul beginning to say, okay, these are the things, Timothy, these are the things that matter. As I'm departing and you're stepping into my slot, here's some things I need you to understand. And so this is where we are. And he says, listen, I'm reminded too that you and me have similarities. I have a heritage of ancestors that have gotten me this far. And he said, and so do you, man. He said, I'm reminded of your sincere faith, just like mine. Man, I got a clear conscience. Timothy, I know you do too. You got a sincere faith, man. You're not in this for something that you can get. Timothy's been in prison too. We know that because the book of Hebrews says that Timothy's been released. Chapter 13, I think, is where he's spoken of. And the book of Hebrews reminds us that Timothy too is in prison. And Timothy was persecuted for the church in Ephesus of where he pastored. And so he says, I'm reminded of that sincere faith. And he said, I remember the first day I met your mom and your grandmother there as we began this church. And he said it lived in them too. Your grandmother, Lois, and your mother, Eunice, were solid God followers. They were devout followers of God. I saw it in them. And when I explained the way and who Christ was, man, they embraced it and they ignited in that. And I've watched them pass the torch on to you. He says, I am persuaded now that God lives in you also in this deep-seated way. Now, that's all we've got time for today. I do want to tell you a little bit about Timothy, though, because the scriptures don't speak a lot about Timothy, but Timothy was a faithful pastor. He was at Ephesus when John the apostle was still kicking and writing, and so it's possible that he could have even been the pastor there when Paul wrote that letter to the church at Ephesus. or Jesus did rather, in the book of the Revelation. But whatever it is, Timothy was a faithful man, and he pastored for a lot of years. In 97 A.D., this is history, not Bible telling us this, but history tells us that he's an 80-year-old man, and there's a big feast and a procession for Diana, who has been the temple was there in Ephesus, and there was great revelry around that. It was a huge evil distraction to living a holy life. And there was a feast going on, and there was a procession going on. And Timothy, now an 80-year-old man, gets out in the streets and says, man, I'm not having this. And he begins to preach the gospel. He begins to try and slow the train down, so to speak. And they begin to beat him there. And then as he falls to the ground, they tie him up and they just drag him through the streets. And when they're done dragging him through, this 80-year-old through the streets, they stone him to death. And so you wonder, man, does he have what it takes to follow in the footsteps of Paul and to be a righteous pastor in the midst of a wicked and perverse area? Absolutely. That's all I got for you today. Man, Lord bless you. Have a great one. I can't wait to see some more of this book tomorrow. Have a good day. And, man, take some time to reminisce. Lord bless you, and I'll see you in the morning, Lord willing.